And we're live. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another on .NET Live. And today we're going to be learning about code coverage in .NET with an open source project called Coverlet. And I have my friend here, Tony, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about this project Coverlet and how exactly we can use it inside of our .NET projects. But before I introduce Tony, I do want to share some links. I do want to share a few announcements about some things that are going on that you might want to know about. Now, first link I'm going to share here in the chat. This is for the Create Serverless event. Now, this is going to be a really exciting event. It's going to be essentially a half day of all serverless live sessions and content. So you can learn about different things like, running things in Azure Functions, creating serverless architectures, security in serverless, which I know is a big thing that a lot of folks care about. So definitely check out the Create Serverless event. It is a free event too. So if you register, you would have to pay 10 easy payments of $0 and 0 cents. You don't have to pay a single dime for it, which I think is absolutely amazing. The next announcement too that I want to share with everyone, just a few days ago, the .NET team released .NET Core 5 RC1. So this is the go live release of .NET Core 5. So if most of you folks know, .NET Core 5 is going to be released sometime in November. So make sure you check it out. Take a look at the blog post that was written by Rich Lander, and he could talk. He talks about a lot of the interesting features and updates that has been put inside of that release. And last thing I want to mention in terms of links anyway, .NET Conf 2. So .NET Conf 2020. Now this is going to be also in November. This is going to be November 10th through 12th. And this is our community event where we talk about all the things that are happening in the world of .NET and the ecosystem in our communities. We're going to have speakers from both Microsoft and our MVPs and our community at large, sharing a lot of cool things that they're doing, cool projects and things of that nature. So make sure you go ahead and save the dates. Click on the link, save the date, and we'll see you all at .NET Conf. Again, that's going to be November 10th through 12th. It'll be 100% live, and it is also free. So, just keep that in mind as well. Now, with that being said, why don't we kind of just go ahead and kick off the show? Let's kind of get into it. Now, I want to introduce my buddy, Tony. So Tony's coming all the way from Africa, where, he works. And, actually, I'll let you talk about it, Tony. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, let folks know who you are, what do you do, and then we'll talk about Coverlet for a little bit.
All right. Thanks a lot, Cecil. Thanks for having me on the show, first of all.
Sure.
So, hey everyone, my name is Tony. As Cecile mentioned, I am the creator and current lead maintainer of Coverlet. I'm also a software engineer at Microsoft. I work on the mixed reality team. Um, think HoloLens, think VR, AR, and related stuff. And like you said, I live in Lagos, Nigeria. I work at the Microsoft engineering office here as well. Uh,
Nice.
nice to be on the show.
Nice. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Microsoft office that's there in Lagos? What is it like? What types of projects do you work on over there?
Okay, so the Microsoft engineering office here in Lagos, we call it the ADC. We call it the ADC West Africa. ADC stands for African Development Center. Think about it as being like an African counterpart to like the Indian Development Center that we also have, and the ADC is in both. So we have ADC West Africa, which is in Lagos, Nigeria, and then we have I think ADC. I don't know whether it's called East Africa, but we have one in Nairobi, Kenya as well. Um, so we do have a few teams here in Lagos. The very first team, the team that I'm currently on, is the mixed reality team. And here we work on like Azure mixed reality services for the Azure cloud. We also do have another team that works on Windows. I guess it's called Windows Update Staging Lab or something similar. It's basically a way to help a platform to help software vendors test out like their software on on new Windows updates before rolling it out to users to ensure that everything works okay. And then we do have a bunch of other teams from Redmond who are also showing interest in, having hiring a team here in Lagos.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just a little over a year now, so we're still very young. So I think in the next couple of years, we'll have a huge number of teams here in Lagos, both Lagos and Nairobi.
Nice, nice. And I'm really interested to know what is the environment like with you all in Africa when it comes to like working from home and dealing with COVID. I mean, so for me, I'm in Florida. I'm in the United States, and I know we're trying to be socially responsible, and a lot of things are closed. A lot of things are happening over the internet and over video, and some people are back at work, some people are working from home. Like, what's the climate like where you are right now in Africa?
Um, so I can't speak for the other parts of Africa, but here in Nigeria, I'll say things are slowly, steadily getting back to normal. So our reported daily active COVID-19 cases are progressing towards zero. We do have restaurants and bars opening up with certain limit restrictions. Um, we do still have curfews, but for at this point, most people are able to go to the office and come back freely. The Microsoft Office here, though, has mandated that we all work from home. So I've pretty
Okay.
much been working from home since March, and I'd say, I mean, typical challenges in this part of the world would be electricity and internet, mostly infrastructure related kind of stuff.
Right.
So sometimes the internet will cut out, sometimes electricity will cut out. I have done my best to kind of mitigate all those problems, though. So. Um, but yeah, it's other than that, it's kind of something we're used to. So we
Yeah.
kind of figure out a way around it. So, well, other than that, it's pretty much just business as usual with
Got it.
some restrictions.
Sure, sure. Okay, and that's fair. And I mean, I'm really glad that you're able to make this call. And I know how fickle things could be, particularly just in this climate, and with all of us dealing with this pandemic and social distancing and whatnot. So I'm gonna cross my fingers and hope that we don't have any internet problems in the stream, and that we're able to go through this whole thing without any without any outages. Right? I hope so, but we'll see. Let's see what happens. Um, so now, with that being said, why don't we go ahead and dive into our topic? So today, like we're here to talk about coverlet. Um, why don't we start off with talking about code coverage? Tell me
Okay.
what like from your perspective, like what is code coverage, and or why should we care about it in terms of software testing?
So code coverage first and foremost is kind of like a software, I think it's called a software quality metric, right? So typical software development lifecycle, you've written your library or you've written your application, right? And then you write unit tests for them, right? Now, in order for you to be confident that the unit tests have been able to cover pretty much every possible scenario that could occur within your code, you kind of decide, okay, you know what, you want to look at how much of your code is executed when all your unit tests run. So code coverage or a code coverage tool like Coverlet comes in there to say, okay, you know what, I will help you figure that out, and all you need to do is ensure that write as much exhaustive tests as possible. So it's mostly, it really helps to catch like edge cases, because for example, you have a method that say divides two numbers. You send in A, you send in B, and then you divide A by B. Now let's say B is 0, then you have a divide by 0 exception, right? So you want to catch that. You want to make sure your code actually performs the right thing when it sees that B is 0. So you have a check within the method to say, okay, if B is 0, just fail gracefully or return 0 or something, and then you need to ensure that that actually works. So writing unit tests to cover that particular scenario. So in a situation where there is no unit test that covers that situation where B is 0, then you'll see it within your code coverage reports, and you realize that, okay, you have to kind of there's certain things you're missing.
Okay, so then I can imagine I have some method that I wrote, like some non-trivial method that it has a lot of different branches, different conditional statements, those types of things in it. And if I'm writing, let's say, an automated test, a unit test using any given unit test framework, right? I probably want to have varying inputs, right? I want to change the inputs. I want to change the conditions of the test, or at least that the method isn't expecting, so that it can exercise those different paths through the code. And I'm guessing what code coverage does is it lets us know with some certain degree of certainty that like 80%, we'll have some number, right? Like 80%, 90%, whatever the case is, this amount of the code has been exercised within the test, right? So then now this is how, so we could use that to say, well, this percentage of the behavior has been tested. And so we generally know, like the tests that we've written are good or not. And again, it doesn't talk about like the quality of the tests, but it does talk about like the different paths that the test does exercise, right?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Fair enough. So when folks also talk about code coverage as a metric, I've been on teams in the past where they're like, oh, well, we have 100% code coverage. You know what I mean? And some people are like, we have 75% code coverage. I'm fine. I'm fine with that. How important is that number? Like in terms of, is 100% something that's practical for all developers to strive for when it comes to talking about code coverage, or do we have to be a little bit more, pragmatic and really think about like what percentage, what number means that like this code has been covered by tests very well?
Well, I would say that's a tricky question. So I would say you definitely want to go for 100%, right? Okay. Because that tells you, and by the way, 100% in all the different metrics. So for example, at least for Coverlet, it does check how much of your methods are covered. So do you have 10 methods? Did you actually test all 10 methods? It also checks branches as well. So the branches within your method, are they covered by your test as well? So all the possible different branches or the possible different paths the execution of your method could take are all those also exercised. And then the next one will be, we also test line coverage. And that's kind of like the all-encompassing one to say, okay, we have 1,000 lines of code. Did you cover all 1,000 lines of them?
Right.
So I'd say 100% is would be the ideal. But yes, we have to be pragmatic and understand that just as unit tests aren't the only way to test code, which is why we have things like integration tests as well. Unit tests will not be able to practically exercise every single bit of the code. So I guess in terms of what an ideal number would be, it would have to vary from team to team and project to project, based entirely on the nature of the code within that project.
Okay. Tony, I think we lost him. Uh-oh. I think we lost him. Hold on, I'm gonna try to get Tony back. I'm try to get him back. I think we lost him.
But on most teams that I've been on, so I'm back.
Hey, what happened?
Remember how you said we hope internet wouldn't cut out? Well,
hey, things happen. And you know what? I didn't make my offering to the demo god. So you know what? I apologize. I'm sorry. Next time I'll learn to make my sacrifices earlier in the day so that we won't have these types of issues. But that's fine.
well, I
That's
mean,
okay.
good thing is I'm back, right? Okay, so where was I? So yes, I was saying the ideal number would really vary from team to team and project to project. Um, So on my team at Microsoft, we have a 95% code coverage threshold. So basically, you won't even be able to check in code if you do not write tests to cover up to 95, to exercise up to 95%, because it also could sometimes get really tricky in object-oriented programming languages like C Sharp and Java and the likes, because
Yeah.
you have a good chunk of indirections and interfaces and so sometimes, and virtual methods and and inheritance and all that stuff, so sometimes that could make things a bit tricky where you know what you actually send into the method isn't what it's called because of some one thing or the other. And
Right.
the idea of things like private methods and internal classes and methods, you have to also be mindful of those of that nuance basically.
Got it. So I know that we have different when it comes to software testing, there's different types of tests, right? Like there's unit testing, and then you know, um, there's integration testing, there's functional testing. Is code coverage something that's really just focused on the unit testing aspect of it, or can code coverage span across different types of testing methods?
Yeah, code coverage can span across different types of testing methods, even like manual QA testing.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, so it's like you're trying to see how much of your code was exercised, right? So anything that involves running the code is a valid way to get the code coverage metric.
Okay. All right. So now let's dive into your project now. Let's talk about Coverlet.
Okay.
Now, look, as folks can imagine, Coverlet is a code coverage tool, which is why we're having this conversation about code coverage in general. But tell me, why is it that you decided to make this project? Like, what was like the genesis moment for you in this?
Yeah. So in the early days of .NET Core, right, where we were moving from .NET Framework to where Microsoft was trying to move people over to this new open source .NET Framework thing they were doing, there were lots of things missing as a result. Like in the early days, we didn't even have. I mean, I remember when it took a while for Entity Framework to even get ported over to work very well, 100% on .NET Core, and so there were a lot of all of these other things missing as well. And I was one who had already started using .NET Core in production since it's like super early days. So I could feel all these little pain points. So a lot of my open source projects were basically just me trying to scratch a particular itch that I had while building. And then at some point, I was like, hey, you know what? Other people will probably find this useful. So I'll just open source it and announce it. Coverlet was that one side project that I did not
Yeah.
expect to grow this
Right. Right.
big.
Right.
Yeah. So coming from, I'd also done a bit of Node as well, and I kind of knew I also kind of knew what experience I was going for, because from the .NET framework days, a lot of the development was hugely Visual Studio focused. So having this whole new paradigm of .NET Core and the CLI and whatnot, I felt, I think this was an itch that I needed to scratch, and I actually felt like this was something a lot of people would also need. Going by all the comments on like the GitHub issues in the Microsoft .NET repos. So yeah, that's kind of the motivation behind. That was kind of the motivation behind Coverlet.
Nice. Every time someone makes a new project, whether it's a personal project, or even something that they're building for like the wider audience and the wider community, I always
Mhm.
ask, how much information or how much programming knowledge did you have before you started working with it to get into that space? So, for instance, for you, like, so you're talking about Coverlet and code coverage. Have you
Mhm.
built developer tools before? Was that something that was in your wheelhouse? And then how do you even start to think about creating a framework or like a library like this to do code coverage? Like, what do you have to know about the runtime and just about C# in general to be able to do that?
All right. So for me, at the time when I decided to venture into Coverlet, I had a few, I think a year or two
Mhm.
of experience building developer tools, right?
Yeah.
Some of which are also developer tools on the .NET platform as well.
Mhm.
Not nearly as popular as Coverlet, but from time to time, you see people as well as companies find good uses for them. And then I'd also contributed to some version of the .NET Core runtime as well.
Mhm.
So I'd
Okay.
had some so I'd had some time to kind of really understand how the runtime works from under the hood, basically, right? So I knew what exactly was missing that made code coverage not possible in the traditional way on Linux, for example, because all the old code coverage tools still worked for .NET Core, but they were Windows only, and that was because the .NET Core at that time hadn't didn't have profiling APIs available on non-Windows platforms,
Yeah.
right? So I always wanted Coverlet to be cross-platform from the get-go.
Mhm.
So knowing that, okay, this is what is missing in the runtime, and these are the alternative ways I can use to actually get the same information was was also very helpful. And then in actually contributing to the runtime, it made me knowledgeable about like MSIL, which is what C# and F# and pretty much .NET based languages compile to,
Yeah.
right? And then that knowledge also helped me because Coverlet has to do like instrumentation and whatnot. Has to like read
Right.
your code, disassemble it, write a bunch of stuff in there to kind of like record lines as the code is executing. So yeah.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So I think we've talked people's ear offs enough. Why don't we take a look at some code, right? How about we share your screen really quickly and take a look and see how, like, what does it actually feel like to use Coverlet on a project that I guess already has some unit tests inside of it.
Okay.
Cool. So I'm gonna share your screen now, and then you can go ahead and open up VS Code or Visual Studio, whatever it is that you prefer. All right, great. So your screen is
Yeah.
up. So why don't you walk us through this really quickly?
Awesome. Okay. So very quick disclaimer: I'm a huge VS Code terminal guy. Haven't
You know what we should do every time he freezes? We should take a screenshot of his face. His screen. We should start making memes out of it. That's what we're gonna start doing. I'm sure he'll be back in a second. We just gotta give the internet a second to kick back in. But if anyone has like screenshot trigger fingers really quickly, we should start screenshotting his stuff. Oh, Tony, come back. I'm gonna try and ping him on the side too. I'm wondering if it's this app that we're using to stream. Hey, did you join in another machine?
No, I'm still on the same one.
Oh, okay.
There are two of me.
Yeah, there's two of you on here. That's what I was asking. All right, I'm gonna remove this, and could you reshare your screen? I think we're seeing something different right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, reshare your screen, and then I don't know what this thing is. I want to kick this. There you go. All right, yeah, reshare your screen, and then we'll try this.
All right. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet. All right, yeah, we can see your screen now. All right, so go ahead and open up VS Code, and
okay,
we'll get back to it. Yep.
All right. So yeah, I was saying before, huge VS Code terminal buff. So apologies to viewers who live and breathe Visual Studio. I probably may not show any of that here. All right. So here, what we have here is again the simplest of math libraries. You can do 4 things. You can add, you can multiply, you can subtract, you can divide. Right. Every single method is pretty straightforward, except divide, because we want to avoid this divide by zero exception. And these are added specifically because I also wanted to demonstrate the branch coverage feature of Coverlet, right? So getting started with Coverlet is actually pretty easy and pretty straightforward, right? So here we have our test unit project right here in mathlib.test. This is a stock template, right? So when you're doing like .NET new X unit or creating a new X unit project in Visual Studio will actually give you basically these 2 things here, right? And if you look at it, you can see that on line 13, we already have this thing called Coverlet.collector. So Coverlet comes out of the box with pretty much all the unit testing templates in Visual Studio and the CLI. My good friends at DevDiv, the people working on VS Test were kind enough to add support for Coverlet directly into the Visual Studio test runner, which is responsible for pretty much running all tests, whether or not you're using XUnit or MS Test or NUnit, right? So, so this is pretty much what you start with. And the very first thing you want to do is you want to add a reference to your library, as you would normally do for a regular unit test project. So here, because we want to test out mathlib, we're just going to add a new reference. Okay, we're going to add a new reference to our mathlib, and yeah, so coming here, we should be able to easily do using mathlib. There we go. So I'm going to just do a quick test add. I want to test the add method, right? So just do assert that equal the arithmetic class add 3 and 4 or 3 and 5. 3 and 5 is 8. Right, so that's something super simple, straightforward test for the add method. We can do a quick .NET test. You see that our test is running normally, and everything is cool. And then I'll show you how to bring in Coverlet once that's done. So running tests, waiting. First time running the test, it's probably going to take a while. Okay, great. So test passed, but I mean we expected that, right? So now you're thinking, okay, great. You have your test. You're about to check in this code into master. Let's see that we're actually covering all the possible different. Let's make sure we're covering all the methods and covering as many lines as possible and whatnot. So what you typically do here is same .NET test, but then you add a collect and then explat code coverage, which basically means cross-platform code coverage.
Okay.
And then and this is pretty much all you need to add in order to get Coverlet to actually instrument the code and record things that happen to it. So what's happening here is after adding that extra collector, Coverlet just before your code runs, just before your test runs, Coverlet opens up the mathlib assembly and then basically instruments it by injecting your IL code, to record. And then basically just writes that back to disk. So when your unit tests are running, they're using this new modified assembly that contains all these instructions, kind of record all the things that are happening. And then once the tests are done, Coverlet is notified, and the first thing it does is it replaces the modified assembly on disk with the original one without all the instrumentation code and everything, and then it basically reads out all the stuff that has been recorded after that test run and calculates everything normally. So you can see that by adding this extra collect expert coverage here, you can see that we have some new outputs in our command line. And then coming here, we have this. So this is a Cobertura, that's the format. It's a relatively popular format. It's also like if you want to use Coverlet in like Azure DevOps, for example, Azure DevOps natively supports Cobertura, and Azure DevOps will actually read this file and show you like fancy graphs and charts and a nice looking visualization of this stuff. Because here you can see we have class name, mathlib.arithmetic. You can see that the file name sends us directly. You can see the add method, the multiply method. And you can see here, the add method line is 6, 7, and 8. If you look over here, you can see that it corresponds 6, 7, and 8. And then you can see how we're like, okay, line 6 was hit, it was run one time. Line 7 was run once. Line 8 was run once. And then you can look at multiply and you can see that 11, 12, 13, 0 hits for pretty much the entire multiply method. Now you can, so Coverlet supports a whole bunch of different things. So this is the Cobertura output format. Coverlet also has its own JSON format. It's just a JSON that we just serialize out the data. So you can actually add a few more. You can actually configure Coverlet by adding a run settings file. So you can do something like coverlet.run settings. And let's see. Yeah. So if you go over to Coverlet's, if you go over to the GitHub, yeah, you can click on. So this is the very first thing we tell you about the VS Test integration, which is what I'm currently showing. And going through to the documentation gives you a bit more detailed information of all the possible things you could do. You could specify the format. You could exclude certain assemblies or types. Especially those ones that are auto-generated. Because if you do a lot of ASP.NET and you work with gRPC and protobufs, you have all this auto-generated stuff that you typically don't have control over, and shouldn't be present in the coverage report. You have you can include certain things. You can also include the test assembly. Yeah, this is it's actually quite interesting. So sometimes you want to ensure that even in your unit tests, all the unit tests are running, and every single bit of your unit tests are running. So you could actually get the coverage of the unit test itself. So it's like testing the coverage of the tests that test the coverage. That's
that makes a lot of sense.
Exception thing going on. Yeah. Yeah. So you can go here for a full, basically just a full rundown of all the different stuff. So coming back here, we can now simply do settings and do coverlet.run settings. Should do another run, and then we specify that we want the JSON format.
Okay.
And so you can see like 2C6 blah blah blah. Yeah, we have the JSON format. So you can see it. JSON is a bit easier to read than XML, so it's a lot clearer. You can see that arithmetic.add, occupies 3 lines, and each of those lines were hit. You can see multiply occupies 3 lines. None of those lines were hit. And you can see if you look at arithmetic.divide, if you remember correctly, we had a branch in there, and Coverlet rightly detects that branch and also includes the branch information and says none of the branches were hit. Now, so I should mention that using Coverlet.collector is the preferred way, and it's the recommended way for making including Coverlet in your project. The reason is because the Visual Studio Test Runner is aware of it. It makes certain concessions to ensure that everything kind of works okay. Because initially we were having situations with really large, with people who had projects that had really large tests. I think 2,000 tests that could run for a long time. We will have situations where the VS test to kind of end the Coverlet process before it was finished collecting. Before it was done, kind of like reading in all the recorded information and doing its calculation and whatnot. So Coverlet.collector was actually written and donated by the VS Test team at Microsoft to ensure that wouldn't be a problem anymore. So it is the recommended way. However, it could be a bit challenging because it doesn't give you instant feedback, right? You have to go open this coverage.json and look through it. And for really large projects, where you have thousands of lines, that would not be. It's hard to get a sort of at the glance overview of whether or not your tests are actually doing what they're meant to do. So that brings me to the next way of including Coverlet, which is the Coverlet.MSBuild package. So I'm going to just comment out this one real quick. And so
Coverlet really quickly. So we do have a couple questions. I didn't mean to cut you off, but we do have a couple questions. I want to make sure that we get to them. So we are live. We do have folks coming from both YouTube and Twitch, and we do have a question. Someone was asking, what's the difference between native Visual Studio Code coverage? So I'm guessing that why would they use Coverlet versus like the code coverage that comes out of the box in Visual Studio? Is the question.
Well, for one, Visual Studio doesn't run on your Linux server in GitHub Actions or ADO, Azure DevOps, and that's actually one of the big reasons that Coverlet had a lot of uptake in usage. Visual Studio inbuilt out of the box code coverage is great. For one, you only have code coverage in Visual Studio with the Enterprise Edition of Visual Studio, not the Community Edition. And then even when you have the Enterprise version, it doesn't really play well with running it headlessly in a Linux CI server or even a Windows CI server.
Yeah.
And for a very long time, the emails I was getting, all the things I was getting was because even some of the issues that were open was basically entire companies trying to move their CI process from heavy Windows servers to more lightweight, like containers in Linux CI servers.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. And kind of along those lines too, I was wondering. So you showed us that file, that output file that was there a little while ago, and we saw how to like we could read the output file, right? But I'm guessing if we were in Visual Studio proper, right? Like Visual Studio on 2019 or whatever, right? Like we'll be able to actually visualize it, right? Like we should be able to like click on the code and it will highlight the covered areas, right? So now we have more of a visual feedback. So instead of having to read XML or JSON, right? Like we can actually see what's the covered area. And I'm guessing there isn't anything like that today for VS Code, is there?
Not out of the box, but I do remember that Scott Hanselman had kind of coupled a few, I think 3 different tools, including Coverlet together, that gave you that exact same experience.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So you definitely want to search Scott Hanselman Coverlet on Google or Bing, and I'm sure you'll find out. I'm sure you'll find the article that kind of delves into how to achieve that same experience with VS Code.
Sure. And I'll look around for it. And if I could find it, then I'll make sure I'll drop it in the chat so folks could take a look at that.
Sure.
And so also with Coverlet too. So you kind of mentioned that like you got that collection from the VS Code team, and they actually
from the VS testing.
From the VS test team. So if I don't have that package, right? You're saying that it won't be able to collect my collections, I guess, or like my output wouldn't be accurate.
Yeah, if you don't have this package in there, like basically, this would have no effect whatsoever. It'll just be completely, it'll be no up.
Got it.
Issue of, because this implies that you're trying to use the collector, the Coverlet collector, and well, because that package is no longer referenced, the VS test runner will not be able to find it, and will just continue on along its merry way.
Okay, fair enough. So like scroll back up there really quickly, because there's something I wanted to ask you about as well. So yeah, scroll up until where you were calling the command. And right there, so you see how you do like a dash collect explat code coverage? Is that is that like a setting, or is that like, can I just put anything in there, or do you have very specific strings that you have to put in that area for?
It's specific.
Okay, so is there more than one thing there, or is there like different things that could go inside of that string?
So Visual Studio Test Runner, or VS Test. I mean, the name Visual Studio kind of misleading. It makes it seem like it only works in Visual Studio, but it's actually the underlying test infrastructure for both Visual Studio and the .NET CLI. So it has a concept of this thing called collectors, which are basically they kind of think of them as plugins that enhance the testing experience in one way or the other, right? Each plugin has an identity, and explat code coverage is Coverlet's own identity within the VS test world. You get, so if you put something else there, if there is no, think for example, let's say for example you wanted to add, there was a plugin that gave you a per test method breakdown of how basically a plugin that a VS test collector that's told you how long each of your test methods took to run, right? And it's called itself test timer, for example, right? So what would happen is you'd add the package reference to that collector. Maybe it's test timer.collector, that's the name of the package and nugget. And then if its identity is test timer, then that is what is going to go in here, and VS test will locate it accordingly. But this is explat code coverage is basically Coverlet's own identity within the whole VS test collector world.
Got it. So as long as I'm using Coverlet, like that's the exact set of characters I have to put inside of there to get it to work.
Yes. Okay. As long as you have this, but you can see I'm about to show another Coverlet package. Coverlet actually comes in three flavors.
Mhm.
Coverlet.collector, which basically allows us to do this, right? And then I'm about to show you Coverlet.MSBuild,
Okay.
which I just added that as a package reference now. So I'll show you also why this is a bit different from the collector. So now bringing in Coverlet.MSBuild, again, if you just do regular .NET test, nothing fancy happens. .NET will just run your test and you're good to go. But with the Coverlet.MSBuild package now in the mix, you want to do this, or you could also do this if you wanted. But I just prefer to do this because that's kind of like the OG way. So you want to do collect coverage. You want to do that to true. By doing this, hit enter, it's going to do all its, this is covered in its magic as well. Also partly done like taking its pretty little time. But yeah, so test run and then instant feedback, right?
Oh, nice. Okay.
You can see where your tests are done running. You can see where it's saying calculating coverage results. You can see where it's saying generating report. And then bloom, bloom, bloom. You can see where it says, it gives you a full. So typically, Coverlet looks for all referenced projects from your unit test project, all reference projects that have debug symbols and instruments there. So let's say we had another library called ImageLib, for example, that did stuff with images, and we had added it as a project reference here as well. And that was also our code. It had its own source library. Coverlet will automatically include that in this report. So you don't have to actually manually specify all those things. It tries to smartly figure out what code is yours or what assembly is yours and what assembly is not. And then it will instrument accordingly. There are, of course, settings and knobs to kind of switch it. It's kind of, tweak that behavior in case you want to be a bit more specific. And I mean, you can see rightly so, see 25% methods. We have 4 methods, but we only have tests for one of the methods. So it makes sense that it is 25% because we only tested a quarter of the methods that we have. So, Coverlet actually is working, thankfully.
Nice. So it's good to also be able to get, like you said, that visual feedback and see those percentages. And that kind of feels like something that we could put into like a .NET Watch, right? Have .NET
Pretty
Watch
much.
and then just have it running. And as we're writing code and as we're writing our tests, we can have those percentages and that visual update happening all the time.
Yeah.
Which I think is cool.
And then you still, of course, get the output as well. The same output you got the last time. So the difference between that one and this one is you still get the output, but you also have the instant visual feedback. You can also set where you actually want the output to go. Unlike with the collector that goes that generates a GUI and just goes somewhere.
Right. Got it. Now we do have some more questions coming in. I want to follow up with this one really quick. And so Santosh is asking, I didn't get the point earlier about having Coverlet show coverage of tests themselves. So maybe we could talk about that for a little bit. So specifically, he's asking about showing the test coverage of the tests, right? So could you say again, like, why was that? Why was that an important thing for us to take a look at?
Okay. Let's see. So sometimes, yeah, this is actually a pretty tough one to explain, but basically you could have 10 unit test methods. Only 9 of them will run for various reasons. So for example, this particular test, I could decide, I think you can actually skip it. Yeah, I could decide to skip it for whatever reason. Right? Now, in this case, I don't have anything, no tests are going to run. So I'm going to get 0%. I'm going to get a 0% code coverage for the original math, for basically MATLib, which I'm trying to test. But then again, you can imagine if this method body was extremely complex, because you do sometimes have unit test methods being, relatively complex depending on what you're trying to test, right? And then you want to ensure that every single, every single thing you're trying to do within the unit test method body is actually done, just so that even your unit test, every single code path in your unit test is also running. Because in a situation where you have some condition here, if whatever, and that will determine whether this line runs. We want to ensure that, and then maybe you have like, this is a theory, for example, instead of a fact. And you have, let's say, integer A and integer B, right? And then so let's say here you want to verify that when B is 0, that it actually returns 0. And then you can do something like if B is 0 on assert that so here you have a branch, right, that may or may not be covered depending on what inline data you actually. So I think you have something like inline data, and it can be like 1 and 2. You get me? Yes. So you have these things, right? You have this inline data. So test add, or you can call it test divide or whatever, it's going to be called with A being 1 and B being 2. You can do an assert here. We could just put the original one. Okay. Yeah. So we have test add being called, A being 1, B being 2, A being 1, B being 3. So this is always going to run. But because we actually do not have a situation where B here is going to be 0, this will never run. So we might not actually get to test that this is working correctly. Of course, this is not how you write an actual unit test in the real world, but it's just demonstrate.
Yeah.
So you could have,
like, as you're doing that, I'm thinking for some folks, like you might have like those test cases, like that test data might be coming in from a file. Right? Like you might read it in from a file or a database or some other data source. And if your data set doesn't test but if it doesn't run all the conditions within your unit test, then you'll end up in a scenario where, like, I don't know, you might have high code coverage, but like, your actual unit test isn't checking all the conditions. Is that possible?
Yes, but then you could also use that to diagnose why you're having low test coverage. Okay. So this not running will mean that, let's say this were the only test we had or we could have, right? This not running will mean that, this is not being tested.
Right.
Sure. Right? Or this is not being covered, right? And then when you're like, oh, why am I getting such low coverage, coverage scores for this particular method, then you can actually have, I think it's call it include test assembly. True. And then you can actually have, you say, I want to include the test assembly and make sure that, all these things are being covered. Because like you said, your data set, it could be coming from a file, it could be coming from, anywhere, right? And if the data set doesn't properly cover all the possible kinds of data your code is supposed to allow, then all your branches will most definitely not be covered. So yes, by running you can see that was also included here. So by running the test coverage on the unit test themselves, it can help you kind of root out the specific problems.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and I think that was very clear, and that makes a lot of sense. And I'm looking in the chat too, and it looks like Santosh completely understands what you're saying. So we're getting close to the end of the show. We do have a couple more questions that I want to make sure we acknowledge really quick before we leave. So here's one from Hussein, and Hussein is asking, any chance of support for .NET framework? I guess with regards to Coverlet.
So Coverlet does support the .NET framework, but it's not. It will work sometimes,
Mhm.
just based on how it's designed.
Okay.
It's but it's not something that we're supporting. So if it works for you on the .NET framework for maybe the relatively simple scenario that you have in mind, all well and good. But if it doesn't, then myself and my two other co-maintainers, Marco and Petley, will. It's not that's not a scenario we want to support, basically. So we'll only prioritize issues that are related to using Coverlet on .NET Core.
Got it.
But there's nothing technically prohibiting Coverlet from being used on the .NET framework.
Got it.
I guess you just have to try.
Got it. And then my question now is going to be, well, what about .NET 5? Because .NET 5 is, like we mentioned before, it's an RC1. We're expecting it to be up before the end of the year. Can, on launch day or sometime soon after, can we have like verified support for .NET 5, not Core 5, but .NET 5 with Coverlet?
In terms of verified support, I can definitely look into that. But I will say this: Coverlet also runs code coverage for uh, .NET itself.
Okay.
So if it works with that, then there's a very good chance that it work with
Sure.
with your stuff that runs on .NET. So like the .NET team was able to get Coverlet. So the code coverage for the code that is used to build .NET is calculated by Coverlet.
Okay.
So there's a very good chance that as long as they didn't run into any problems with that, then they wouldn't run. You shouldn't run into any problems with .NET 5. And Coverlet's design is such a way it doesn't depend on any runtime features at all. It's purely just it's purely just moving data around. So even the IL that it does, it's basically just modifying the IL, and it's not. There's no fancy runtime under the hood thing that it's trying to do. So it's pretty resilient, from version to version of the runtime.
Cool. Awesome. Great. All right, we're gonna switch away from the screen really quick as we enter into our wrap up. But so thank you, Toni, for coming on. I definitely really appreciate you spending some
Thank you
time
for
with us
having
today.
me.
I know it's really late where you are. It's like 9, 10 o'clock at night or something like that. So I really appreciate you spending your evening with us and my afternoon and some other people's mornings because we have people from all over the place. Um, for folks that are watching and maybe they want to get involved in Coverlet, they want to know, where can they send issues? How can they share feedback and that type of stuff? Where's the place that you think would be best to do that?
Definitely the Coverlet repo on GitHub.
Okay, so definitely go to
So
GitHub, submit an
yeah, or
issue, and
you can
share
add
feedback.
me you can also add me on Twitter
Okay,
at Tornado. Yeah,
and I'll make sure too that I share your Twitter accounts in the chat. Give me 1 second. I'll do that right now. There you go. So there is Tony's Twitter account, and it's up now on the screen. So make sure you follow Tony. Just send him a hi and say, "Hey, I loved your episode. I want to learn more about Coverlet." So I'm messaging you, right? But thank you, Tony, and thank you all for watching. This has been another episode of On.NET Live. Again, these are bi-monthly shows. We're going to do another one in maybe about 2 weeks, and I'm definitely looking forward to later in the year when we get to talk a little bit more about .NET 5. But if you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like to hear about, for folks that you'd like to see come on the show, definitely let us know. Tweet us at @.net or hashtag on .net if you want. Like either one of those are fine. And let us know what you want to see. So other than that, thank you all. I hope you all have a good day. Take care. And Tony, thank you again for coming on. I appreciate it.
thank you for having me. Had fun. All right.